is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
China's biggest political event this year, the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party of China, has wound up at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. Closely watched globally, it determines party leadership and the direction of the country's domestic and foreign policy. This week on Talk Africa, we examine some of the CPC's achievements in the last decade and how these have impacted Africa's political, social and economic development. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. At the opening of the Congress, President Xi Jinping unveiled a report showcasing some of the goals of the CPC in the coming years. Before we begin our discussion, let's take a listen at the highlights of his address.
From this day forward, the central task of the Communist Party of China will be to lead the Chinese people of all ethnic groups in a concerted effort to realize the second centenary goal of building China into a great modern socialist country in all respects, and to advance the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation on all fronts through a Chinese path to modernization. To build a modern socialist country in all respects, we must first and foremost pursue high-quality development. Development is our party's top priority in governing and rejuvenating China, for without solid material and technological foundations, we cannot hope to build a great modern socialist country in all respects. We must uphold and improve China's basic socialist economic system. We must unswervingly consolidate and develop the public sector and unswervingly encourage, support and guide the development of the non-public sector. We will work to see that the market plays a decisive role in resource allocation and that the government better plays its role. China has always been committed to its foreign policy goals of upholding world peace and promoting common development, and it is dedicated to promoting a human community with a shared future. China remains firm in pursuing an independent foreign policy of peace. It has always decided its position and policy on issues based on their own merits, and it has strived to uphold the basic norms governing international relations and to safeguard international fairness and justice.
Well, joining me now to unpack the significance of the 20th CPC National Congress are from Beijing, Victor Gao, current affairs commentator and chairman of the China Energy and Security Institute. In Johannesburg, Professor David Monyae, international relations and foreign policy expert and director at the University of Johannesburg Center for Africa-China Studies. And from Nairobi, Dr. Adere Kavins, an international relations scholar with a focus on China-Africa relations. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Victor Gao, if I may start off with you, because you're following the development in Beijing. The biggest political event of the year is now happening in China. What is the CPC National Congress about it? Why is it important?
This 20th Party Congress is extremely important because it will summarize what has happened over the past 5 years or even past 10 years since President Xi Jinping became the paramount leader of the Communist Party of China, as well as of Chinese president and the chairman of the Central Military Commission. And it will also forecast into the coming 5 years and all the way to year 2035, as well as to the middle of this century. Therefore, not only in terms of matters within the CPC itself, for example, appointment of new members of the CPC Central Committee, Politburo, Standing Committee on the Politburo, etc., but also in terms of formulating new strategies and charting out the new roadmap for China as a whole, as well as how to position China's relations with the rest of the world, including with African countries, for example. This is the most important thing. And because China is such an important and influential country on the global stage, whatever CPC 20th Party Congress will do will have a major impact on the global affairs.
This will have a major impact on global affairs. Dr. Adera, so what does the Party Congress mean for China's policy agenda, but also particularly for the broader international community?
China has become a very important international actor. And what happens in China now has implications for the rest of the world. More so the developing South, where China has become a leading development projects financier, for example, here in Africa. Chinese foreign policy objectives and strategies such as Belt and Road Initiative have continued to be implemented around the world. And this Congress, what is going to happen here in terms of the decisions that are going to be made will have real implications for development aspirations of many countries around the world, and not least here in Africa. And that is why I think many people in the continent are watching to see what is likely to happen, what new policies are coming out, how are they likely to impact the relations between China and African countries individually, and also at the regional level, especially through initiatives or platforms like the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation.
Right, so we're going to look a little bit later on those implications for African countries particularly. But Professor Munyai, we do know that China has dramatically changed in the last 10 years. What would you say have been some of China's biggest achievements over time?
I think we have seen massive movement within China in terms of development in uplifting people from poverty, development in infrastructure development, as well as technological advancement. And beyond that, I think what President Xi Jinping and CPC have done extremely well, which is a lesson for Africa, is to be people-centered and sensitive to issues that the wider community confronts. I think we've seen the widening of the rule of law, as well as stabilization and fulfillment of 1949 revolutionary aspiration of unifying the entire China. And I think we've seen stability in Macau, right. Going back to China. We've seen the Hong Kong stabilized, and with an outstanding Taiwan. These are key issues that particularly African leaders are watching quite closely and learn from China.
Victor Gao, you're following this from Beijing, of course, and many people have been looking back over the last 5 years or 10 years and noting the achievements that China have made. From a Chinese standpoint, what have been some of the biggest achievements?
Well, quite a few, as a matter of fact. For example, over the past 10 years, China has become the largest country in terms of the fast speed train. And China ranks #1 in terms of the total mileage, but also in terms of the complete nationwide network. And China is already helping other countries, including, for example, Indonesia and other ASEAN countries in building up their fast speed train. And I hope China will also help many African countries to start building this very important infrastructure as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Secondly, China has achieved major breakthroughs in technological development in terms of deep space, for example, deep sea, AI, and 5G, 6G, you name it. And to such an extent that it is generally believed that by 2024, the Chinese space station will be the only space station orbiting the Earth. And further, I would say, China has projected a new way looking forward. That is the shared future of mankind as a whole, basically focusing on treating every country, big or small, as an equal, and no country should be left behind. So I think China not only has done a wonderful job economically speaking at home with many countries in the world, and also has projected a better vision for the world. That is a world based on equality and sustainability, and every country will cooperate together rather than, for example, artificially or arbitrarily being divided into opposing blocks.
Right. Dr. Adera, let me come back to you because we want to look at this from Africa's standpoint. And China is Africa's largest trade partner today. So what have been, when you look at it though, what have been some of the biggest achievements from an African standpoint and in relation to Africa?
I think, as you rightfully said, for 13 years in a row, China has been Africa's largest trade partner. In the last decade, Chinese companies operating in Africa has contributed to 20%, economic growth of the continent. And we've seen China, emerge as the most favored destination by young Africans seeking higher education abroad. Actually, a recent survey indicates that more young Africans believe that China has had net positive good, in its cooperation with Africa compared to their traditional partners of the continent. We've also seen China engage in massive modernization of Africa's productive sectors, ranging from transportation to digital inclusion, energy, as well as health and education. These achievements have also come as a result of, I think, a peaceable foreign policy platform upon which China has engaged, African countries. I think President Xi Jinping, for instance, has won many African leaders simply because he carries a message of development and peace compared to, for example, messages coming from other capitals around the world. So some of these successes, I hope, that they can be built on. For example, in terms of promoting greater trade inclusion, not just the numbers, but also in terms of quality.
So let me look at some of the statements that came out of the Congress, because Xi Jinping, Victor Gao, Xi Jinping said during the Congress that China will accelerate creating a new development pattern and making the domestic market stronger. What exactly does that mean? Are we likely to see a continuity in policy, or is there going to be a paradigm shift, Victor?
No, I don't think there will be a major paradigm shift for China. And as far as Africa is concerned, for example, yes, China was very much involved in many African countries when they were doing their best to achieve national independence, for example. That's very political and very strategic. But since 2000, China has been increasingly involved in many African countries to such an extent, as the other panelists correctly said, that China has been the largest trading partner with Africa as a whole continent and also with many African countries. Now, back in the 1960s and 1970s, many people in the world tend to say that Africa was the forgotten continent. I think it is true that it is mainly due to China's relentless efforts in engaging with Africa and engaging with the African brothers and sisters, that Africa is now one of the most promising continents in the whole world. And different countries from different parts of the world are now talking about making investments, engage with African people and companies, for example. This is truly a very good turnaround of the events. From the Chinese perspective, we do believe that China and Africa are equal, and all of us need to treat each other as brothers and sisters. I always believe that whatever China can do, African countries can do the same. So long as we focus on development and opening up our economies to the rest of the world, and focus on peace and avoid any confrontation or rivalry or war.
All right, we're going to take a short break now. Do stay with us. When we come back, we'll carry on with our discussion on the 20th CPC in National Congress. Don't go away. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are Victor Gao, Professor David Monyai, and Dr. Adere Cavins. Before the break, we looked at the achievements of the CPC in the last decade. Let's now look at how Chinese foreign policy may impact Africa in coming years. Dr. Adere, would you talk about the impact that China has had on Africa over the last decade? Now, China has unveiled its new dual circulation development plan where domestic and external markets can reinforce each other. How exactly will this work? How will this create new opportunities, particularly for Africa?
Well, we've seen, I think, from the Congress, the President Xi Jinping's address, where there's an emphasis, for example, maybe movement towards a more service-oriented economy for China, the issue of dual circulation, where China is trying to fortify its own domestic market, while at the same time continuing with its reform and opening and welcoming the rest of the world to trade with China. I think there is an opportunity here for Africa to take advantage, for example, of the Chinese consumer market. China has, in recent years, stated very clearly the interest to promote, African agricultural produce into the Chinese market through, for example, the Green Lanes initiative launched in Dakar FOCAC forum. And I think that countries like Kenya have already taken advantage of some of these opportunities, for example, with the export of fresh avocado fruits to China, becoming the first country in Africa to do so. And as China turns more towards services, that then leaves an opportunity for Africa to take advantage of the manufacturing capabilities that China might be willing to offshore. And I believe that Africa has the skills needed as the infrastructure that has been put in place thanks to its strategic partnership with China, and an increasingly agile population that is willing to tap into some of these opportunities. So I believe that while China is deploying the so-called dual circulation strategy in its economic fortification, the capability and opportunity to work with Africa still exists.
All right, Professor Monya, what are the opportunities, though? Because even as you talked about reform and opening up, which has been the party's guiding principle over the past 4 decades, now by applying the new development, philosophy and making the domestic market a mainstay, do you feel that China is beginning to look forward? Is China beginning to look inward?
I think you're going to see a China that is opening, but quality opening. What do I mean by that? That it is not going to be like in 1978 or 2000, where it was endless opening. It will be a question of taking advantage of its population. That has changed. The population is aging, yet it's also upskilling with wealth, a middle class going beyond 400 million. And that it opens opportunity for a number of countries in the world, particularly Africa, in a number of sectors. For instance, the tourism sector. It will open up opportunity given the fact that China is stabilizing its security, allowing more Chinese coming to the African continent. But beyond that, you're going to see different kind of investments. Recently, while my colleague is talking about avocado from Kenya to China, in our neighboring country, Zimbabwe, Chinese are helping Zimbabweans opening what is coming to become the biggest steel plant,
right.
Much bigger than the South African plant. So I think that will go a long way in boosting Africa's Agenda 2063, in ensuring that more investments, more Africans are involved, and Africa refines its raw material. I think beneficiation is quite critical for Africans.
All right, Victor Gao, tell us about the Chinese-style modernization and how this will conform to socialist values. What are the defining aspects and how will this impact the global landscape?
This is a new concept that President Xi Jinping first brought to the attention of the whole party and the whole nation at the beginning day of the 20th Party Congress. My understanding is that the Chinese style pathway to modernization has several crucial importance and important points. One is that the Chinese modernization need to be inclusive, meaning that no one in China should be left behind. Everyone should be entitled to participating in the accumulated wealth for the Chinese people, and wealth polarization should be minimized rather than being allowed to be maximized. In that way, the Chinese society will be more equal and equitable, social justice will be more enhanced, and everyone will be happy, while incentives will continue to be provided for innovation, creativity, and entrepreneurship But in the secondary redistribution sector, for example, the whole society need to be made more equitable. That's number one. Number two is that the Chinese economic development and modernization going forward need to be more conscientious as far as environmental protection is concerned. That is, how to protect the mountains and the rivers from pollution, and how to make sure that the social awareness of the importance of environmental protection and fulfilling our responsibilities under the climate change agreements, for example, need to be achieved. And then the whole society will be more beautiful and more ecologically livable. Now, the other point, allow me to emphasize very quickly, that is the Chinese modernization need to be very much based on technological breakthroughs and creativity. We need to move from made in China to design in China, and then eventually invented in China. This will be a crucial transformation. And by doing that, the Chinese modernization will be more user-friendly, more environmentally friendly, and more justice-oriented. And this applies to China itself as well as to all the trading partners of China.
Dr. Adere, even as we look at China's domestic policies and how this will affect the global landscape, the IMF is predicting that the world will fall into economic recession in 2023. Now, with greater weight being put on domestic demand-driven growth, how will China's economic policies affect Africa's economic recovery path?
I think China has become one of the most important economic partners, for example, for many African countries. This Congress is taking place at a time of great international peril, characterized by, the conflict going on in Ukraine. Many economies are still struggling to climb out of the COVID-19 pandemic situation. And then some countries like Kenya are facing dire situations as a result of the aggravated impacts of climate change. Now, Chinese decision-making will be very influential in terms of how China plays its international roles and obligations. Remember that China is the second largest economy, accounts for over 18% of the global economy. The stability of the Chinese economy in itself is a stabilizing factor for the international economy. And that has got to do with the well-being of these emerging economies. Now, China is also a major creditor for many African economies, and how they make, agreeable frameworks of managing the debt so that the African affected by the difficulties occasioned by this triple effect of climate change, pandemic, and conflict are able to navigate out of these tough economic times ahead. So I believe at multilateral level, again, China is expected to play a strong multilateral, move as a unifier, as a champion of the interests of developing countries, so that even within the forums like IMF, there can be responsive policies that can also aid, a movement of these most affected developing economies out of the imminent economic recession.
Right. Professor Monyai, I do want to, very briefly look at the foreign policy aspect as Dr. Adere talks about China being a unifying factor, because President Xi Jinping said that a significant shift is currently taking place in the international balance of power, and that it presents a historic opportunity for China. So how do you see China positioning itself to raise its standing and influence in the world?
It's a question of China playing within multilateral system, bringing stability, the rule of law, and ensuring that Africa is involved. There are a number of platforms in which China will do so. China plays a critical role within BRICS, for instance, in which South Africa is a member, and there might be one or more African countries joining. And beyond that, China is playing a critical role within the United Nations Security Council, where serious decisions are made affecting the African continent, particularly in peacekeeping, conflict resolution issues, where China is needed. One other major issue is to do with health and the lessons we've learned from the pandemic, COVID-19. I think you've seen the change of your value chain when it comes to vaccines, and there are possibilities that China will boost its investments in manufacturing of vaccines on the African soil and continue to play the key role it has been playing in the pandemics, whether it's Ebola or any other future pandemics, given the lessons we've learned. And all this will be done at a multilateral level, bilateral level, bringing all efforts to train and boost Africa's own health infrastructure through the establishment of Africa's own CDC in Addis Ababa. And we're seeing more efforts taken in other areas in opening up Africa in a much more organized, less conflict-ridden, and ensure that the geopolitics, particularly tension with the United States, does not negatively affect the African continent.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to wrap up in a minute. I want to get a very brief comment from you on the key takeaways. Victor Gao, let me start off with you. What are your key takeaways from the 20th Party Congress, and what do we expect from China over the next 5 years?
First of all, China and the Communist Party of China and the Chinese nation will be more united in the immediate aftermath of the 20th Party Congress. And China will be more focused on domestic development as well as overseas engagements, and China will become a more important and influential force standing up for peace, development, and cooperation, and against any attempts to launch another Cold War or several Cold Wars or even hot wars in the world. So in that sense, China is a major force for multilateralism, globalization, and peaceful cooperation between and among nations. And this applies to China's relations with Africa as a continent, as well as all the African countries.
Dr. Adere, your views on the key takeaways from the Congress and what to expect from China over the next 5 years?
Well, I think one lesson is that it pays to have a knowledge-based bureaucracy and political stability if a country has to move forward. And I think this is a major lesson that African countries can draw from China. I've also liked the fact that the Congress seemed to be talking about a high-quality development, placing emphasis on quality. And this is good going forward because both Africa and China are in need of designing new strategies that can promote sustainable, inclusive, and innovative ways of engaging across the sectors that they've been engaging in.
Professor Munyai, your final word?
Lessons learned is that the Chinese Communist Party is people-centered. It lives up to its aspiration of 1949 of unifying China. These are some of the major issues, as well as dealing with some of the challenges that Africa is confronting. Fight corruption, and then ensure that you have a highly learned bureaucracy that delivers, that is people-centered. I think that in itself is a major lesson that Africa should and must learn from China.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for your thoughts. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to all our guests. Victor Gao, current affairs commentator and chairman of the China Energy and Security Institute. Professor David Munyai, international relations and foreign policy expert and director at the University of Johannesburg Center for Africa-China Studies. And Dr. Adere Kavins, international relations scholar with a focus on China-Africa relations. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, it's goodbye.